program at Fourth. So what we do is we provide guidance and support and technical assistance to multifamily EV charging decision makers. And that includes, utilities, local governments, decision makers at multifamily properties. Some of those service offerings that we provide are free multifamily project consultations. So project level at your property guidance about how to move through an EV charging project based on your unique property details. And these are all hyperlinked. When you get the slides, you'll be able to click through each of these resources. We also have wonderful market segmented multifamily EV charging installation toolkits. We have a great project builder tool that's updated regularly with new incentives that have multifamily focus throughout the country. We have educational one-pagers. We have a case study library that we've developed over the last 2 years and are still adding to. We have a glossary of terms, and we have some resident empowerment resources as well. So we try to keep it comprehensive. We do lots of partnering. If you're interested in connecting with Charge at Home about anything multifamily EV charging or Fourth at all, you can reach out to us. We have an info email at the end, and we'll drop our email addresses in the chat as well. So we can go ahead and get started. I want to do a quick introduction to our wonderful, wonderful panelist, Alan. Alan is wonderful. We are working on a great document with him right now, which we'll be publishing soon and we'll probably talk about in a bit. But Alan Hejl is the founder and lead consultant at Spark Access with the mission to improve accessibility and disability inclusion across the mobility industry for people with disabilities on a philosophy that promotes inclusion over compliance. So Alan is the best, as we've already mentioned. My colleague, Whit Jameson, who's our senior specialist here at Fourth with EV charging, also great focus on multifamily. He'll be popping in at the Q&A at the end. So if he comes off mute, that's who that is. Also, you can put questions in the chat. We will address questions as they come in, depending on the question, or we'll answer them at the end. We try to leave about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So if we can't get to your questions, we will answer them after via email. And that is all I've got for you. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to Alan. Thanks, Alan.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna. Welcome, everybody. I'm really happy to be here for Earth Day. If you can't tell by my background, I've got a full Michigan native wildflower prairie in my small front yard. So it's an important day for me. But yeah, thanks again for the warm welcome from Fourth. And today we're here to talk about accessible electric vehicle charging at multifamily properties. Just a quick preface, this is capital A accessibility, so the technology that's there to support people with disabilities, not the lowercase a accessibility. We'll start here with just a little intro to my background and kind of my experience. I'll walk folks through a few disability fundamentals that are always good to prime discussions around accessibility. And then we'll talk about just the standard salad and all of the things that we reference when we talk about meeting the obligations of the ADA and how that trickles into other codes like the ABA, PROAG, more. We've got a lot to cover today. And then inaccessibility, like what are those key elements for accessible EV charging? And then we'll cover a few common conflicts that arise with multifamily charging, where, as we all know, a lot of it's not standard. So there's always a lot of nuance to how standards are interpreted and ultimately how we serve residents with disabilities. And then we'll close out with just a few resources of where to find more answers. And we'll definitely be having at least 20 minutes here for questions at the end. So a little bit about me. Anna did a really great job introducing me. I really built Spark Access on my lived experience as someone with a disability. I'm a professional with ADHD, chronic nerve pain after a viral fever several years ago. And then I've given up on running just every single time I try. I ran about 45 Ks and a few marathons, but I've got extensor tendonitis, plantar fasciitis, you name it. Now I wear custom orthotics for the rest of my life. And then my wife, who's a manual chair user, and actually a designer at Ford Motor Company that helped design the Mustang Mach-E. You'll see her featured throughout a lot of my presentation pictures of helping model some of those accessible elements. And then I'm a disability-owned business, certified accessibility professional from a few different angles. And I most recently got kind of my ADA coordinator certification of really helping define, like when we are talking about ADA compliance, what is that floor so that we can go above and beyond the minimums. And all that's to say it's built on 15 years in the auto industry between Ford Motor Company and then General Motors, where at General Motors, I started the auto industry's first accessibility department, focused on everything from how do we get better grab handles in large vehicles to the future of autonomous vehicles and accessibility. And then I worked a lot with the GM Energy team on some of their partnerships and strategies around accessibility for EV charging. And that career is all built on being an advocate first and foremost. So before I got into accessibility professionally, I've always given to my community, and I lead a local commission in Ferndale, Michigan, where I live. I'm a board member on the Michigan Disability Rights Coalition. And I do a lot of volunteering with Detroit Disability Power and the local impact for disability inclusion in Detroit. So yeah, that's a lot. You could tell. I've put a lot of passion into this space and helping really provide that future for mobility. And that's what led me to start Spark Access, is to really be that catalyst for accessibility and disability inclusion across the mobility industry, to build an inclusive future and sense of belonging for people with disabilities. And where often people with disabilities aren't at the table in this industry, to have a voice and to have those requirements understood and to be visible. There's still a long way to go. So I do what I can to help spur that. And one of those angles is helping educate on standards to hopefully lead to that community engagement down the line. Just a little nod to the Spark Access and my philosophy as well. I have a little screenshot here of the initial curb cut protests in Berkeley, California in the 70s, where wheelchair users had to take sledgehammers to the curb to get the point across that we need curb cuts. And the curb cut is held as this artifact of inclusive and universal design across our communities, where every sidewalk has them in the US, where that helps you, whether you're a wheelchair user, whether you're operating a stroller, or whether you're having goods delivered or moving. The curb cut provides this universal benefit. And to get that, it required action, and it required protests, and it required removing barriers. So some of that philosophy behind accessibility is it's equal parts good proactive measures, but it's also removing the inherent barriers along the way with a little bit of action and protest involved. So to understand this work, I just want to make sure we're all clear on terminology as we get into it. But I'm here to talk about kind of disability fundamentals. And something that comes up often is people don't want to say the D word. They're really uncomfortable talking about disability. And there's a lot of inherent stigma in our society around disability that makes it a hard word to talk about. But I really like the United Nations has one of the most comprehensive definitions that I like around disability, where its persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And I think the important part there is it's that interaction with barriers. And it helps kind of shift the model and way of thinking that disability is just as much about how we treat other humans as it is about how we create our environments around us. And if we can create a barrier-free environment, then that stigma against disability starts to disappear. Accessibility is another one. I opened with, this is uppercase A accessibility, which is a global professional domain on technology around people with disabilities. One of the most comprehensive definitions in kind of the US lens came from a previous administration, and it defined it as the term accessibility means the design, construction, development, and maintenance of facilities, information and communication technology, programs, and services so that all people, including people with disabilities, can fully and independently use them. And that's kind of that comprehensive, it's both the built environment, it's how we treat people when they're in our spaces through services and programming. And it's also kind of the digital world of information and technology as well. So it's this comprehensive definition that kind of full circle we need to be considerate of accessibility. I usually don't like getting into nuance of vocabulary because everybody's coming at things from a different place in their lives and a different journey. But particularly this conversation where we'll be talking about parking a lot, the terms come up where uh, we use person first language typically within the disability community, which is people with disabilities as a generic catch all, or we use identity first language, which is disabled person. Usually, if we're trying to not say disability, that's to be avoided at all costs, where there's people make up words, where there's diverse abilities, differently abled, handicap, which is actually a reference to beggars who had caps in their hands. So we avoid handicapped. And then one of the worst is special needs, where everyone in the world has specific needs. And special needs is not kind of a preferred term from the disability community. Wheelchair users, how we would refer to wheelchair users. My wife is a wheelchair user. Wheelchair bound is far out of fashion. We refer to parking as accessible parking, and this is some state legislation like Michigan, New York, DC. A lot of places have started changing this at the DOT level, where we refer to it as accessible parking and not handicap parking. For that reason, I said earlier, where handicap is kind of an old vernacular. And then not editorializing disability, so not projecting that somebody might suffer from their disability, but just saying has a disability is a fine way to address that. So this is not a DEI presentation today, but this is a really important slice of understanding the world of accessibility as we dig into it technically. And all that's to say, disability is a huge part of our society. A lot of folks don't understand it's one of the largest minority groups in the world. It's one of the largest in the United States. The CDC tracks this number and updates it every year. And we're at about 28.7% of the US population. That's 1 in 4 people have disabilities. We've got 17% of the global population, another huge demographic. And again, this cuts through every corner of our society. Every community has experience with disability. So it's a really important demographic, and one that it's why we have the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities and why this is a global domain. We also have the aging population. So the age of folks over 60 is set to double by 2050. I love the AARP refers to this as the silver tsunami that's coming, where a lot of our infrastructure, program systems, housing is not meant to address a population of that size aging. And people are living longer and longer lives as well. So this big wave is coming that's going to kind of stress test all of our systems. On top of that, as I said, I'm based in Michigan and the Detroit area. So I usually don't have to explain this one too much locally to folks, but temporary disabilities as well, where some seasons you could be a slip on the ice away, or a tennis injury and a rotator cuff surgery away from becoming part of the disability community. And suddenly you're kind of thrown into a world where you don't know if this infrastructure can be used for you or not. When we think of disability as well, to talk to these numbers, we often think of physical mobility as the first and foremost because it's the most visible. It's the one we see every day when we go to park. That's the sign. It's what's on the restrooms for that wheelchair access. But disability also comes in a lot of other forms across physical mobility, which can be apparent or not apparent. There's also deaf and hard of hearing disabilities, blind and low vision disabilities, cognitive and emotional disabilities, and then speech disabilities. And there can be intersection between multiple disabilities for folks as well. To touch on housing and relevant to multifamily housing, other good statistics to understand is that 5% or less of housing is accessible in the United States. And of that 5%, only 1% is considered fully barrier free. And it's thanks to things like the Fair Housing Act, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that applies to 4 more multifamily properties that we have any accessible housing. So a lot of accessible housing is concentrated in multifamily home developments. So that's a lot of kind of the foundation around disability. Now we're going to get into standards, and there's a lot of kind of three-letter acronyms here with ADA, ABA, FHA, IBC. So we'll start to explore what we're talking about when we talk about standards around accessibility and how that applies to multifamily charging. So kind of the map of understanding disability and policy, I think one we're all pretty familiar with is the ADA. And we often hear things have to be ADA compliant, things have to meet the ADA. The requirements are usually written into things that infrastructure has to kind of meet this requirement. But what does that mean when the ADA is a civil rights law? And so at the end of the day, the ADA is this umbrella for civil rights in the United States that at the end of the day guarantees a person with a disability won't be discriminated against when they're using our infrastructure, when they're participating in our community, when they're trying to find jobs and go to work, and when they're trying to find housing and have kind of an independent life. And so something to understand is when we're saying something's ADA compliant, we're actually saying this isn't going to discriminate against people with disabilities. And that's a really hard promise to make when you don't understand all the technical requirements under that umbrella. So it's something that definitely needs to be explored and focused on a little more and broken down to create effective programs. So under the ADA, it often harmonizes into other departments across the federal government, state government, and local government. And we have these sets of policies that start to reflect the nature of the ADA and help express that for reinforcement. An important component as well to understand is that the ADA is a function of the judicial department. So it's very reactionary in the United States, where we often think of the ADA as well through the terms of lawsuit, because that's how it was designed. And it's an unfortunate shortcoming that it carries that stigma with it. But the ADA as itself is the civil rights law that's based on a reaction of discrimination. So it comes to other policies to pick up the proactive slack. And that's where under the federal government, we have like the Architecture Barriers Act for federal programs that provide barrier-free standards for housing. We have the Fair Housing Act. We have the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which 504 clarifies kind of accessible housing and the guarantee of that. 508 is more of the digital environment, making sure that's accessible. We have digital accessibility requirements with WCAG 2.1 AA is kind of the new nomenclature for all federal, state, and local digital services. Under the states, every state has a Department of Transportation or a Department of Energy that has to manage its obligation to the ADA through technical requirements. Housing is another one where there's different housing policies in different states and different communities that affect their ability to provide kind of accessible measures in housing. And then something that's big, it's different everywhere you go, is the adoption of building code. Through the International Code Council, International Building Code, or International Residential Building Code. Every state, every city is usually a little different and a little nuanced in their adoption of that. Michigan, as an example, we just got 2021 building code exactly 1 year ago in 2025. And we're on a 6-year cycle in Michigan to adopt new code. So that's Michigan, but every state is a little different. California being one of the most progressive and one of the most kind of robust and having unique parameters. And then some states don't adopt building code at all, and it's left to cities to do. And that's where you have local policies and kind of your front end ordinances can sometimes be the most powerful, where every community of more than 50 people has to have an ADA transition plan and an ADA coordinator. And they often help interpret these policies as well. And it can impact things like zoning and ordinance as those evolve and mature. So this is a lot to digest. We'll start breaking it down just a little bit more. To zoom in on multifamily charging, where a lot of folks have assumptions of what do those accessibility requirements or guidelines apply to. It's the short answer is any charging format where there's people involved, it should be accessible. People are family members, people are workers, people are in our communities. And as I said earlier, with temporary disabilities or even lifelong disabilities, those people could be us. So as we're building infrastructure, knowing that it's also future proofing for ourselves. But EV charging, there are a lot of requirements for multifamily home charging that we'll get into that do apply. One of the most key things, though, is it's how chargers are funded, which is critical for understanding program implementation, where anything that's receiving federal, state, or local government funds, that then kind of shifts the terms into being considered public funding for our infrastructure or digital services for kind of the app backend and payment backends of chargers. And that often is what determines the requirements that apply. So if a charger is going in non-public space, but is getting federal funding to do that, it may have parameters of the Architectural Barriers Act that apply to increase that operability of a charger. So just as one example. Just gonna take a sip of water real quick. So one of the key things with multifamily charging is the Fair Housing Act. And this was an act passed in 1968 centered on racial segregation of housing and the very steep inequities that we had in housing in the US back in the 60s and the civil rights movement and our various riots that led to a lot of civil progress. While it was based on race through the evolution of civil rights in the US, the Fair Housing Amendment Act in 1988 added disability as a protected class. And that was kind of building on the momentum that led to the ADA being passed in 1990. Was a growing momentum around disability being a recognized class in the US. It didn't take until 10 years later for the Fair Housing Design Manual to be published. And that's what really clarified what does accessibility in housing mean, and they provided a technical grounding for that of different requirements. One of the key ones is this requirement too for accessible common and public use areas, where any shared things in a housing development have to be accessible, and they have to be accessible in a few different ways. I think relevant to EV charging is a definition around parking, where any parking type that can be kind of split out or separated or monetarily advantaged in any way, 2% of any type of parking has to be accessible. And then that also has to have an accessible route connecting the parking to those other amenities within a housing development. So through that application, it really clarifies EV charging is a unique parking type. And so per the Fair Housing Act and a lot of the guidance from HUD, 2% of that under the Fair Housing Act should be accessible. And I should say at least 2% has to be accessible, where there are other things that can influence that ratio as well as we get into some other layers of code. The other key thing, and I should have blown this up to maybe be its own slide, but is reasonable accommodations and understanding accommodations in housing for people with disabilities. We know that accessible housing is a challenge. And so a lot of the ways that's addressed is through kind of a request system where under kind of HUD managed programs, people with disabilities can request of their housing provider what they need. And so if you're not in a perfectly accessible unit, it's under kind of the reasonable accommodations that it's a housing's responsibility to provide those accommodations so that you can live independently. There's a lot of nuance to this, and hopefully we'll get some questions at the end to go into reasonable accommodations. But at the end of the day, as long as what a person with a disability is requesting is well within kind of the scope of what they're paying for rent and what the housing development is, it should be fulfilled to the best extent it can be. And there's large cadence, both legally and socially, to do that. And when we're talking about brand new infrastructure like EV charging, that's an example where a resident should be able to request accessible EV charging. And they should have that fulfilled. So thinking of ways to design this in advance so that it lowers the cost of expensive retrofits or expensive kind of after the fact accommodations, addressing it up front when we have kind of either blank slates or brand new programs to consider from the start, we can start thinking of people with disabilities as using our EV charging infrastructure in those housing developments. I touched on a little bit, but international building code is another big aspect, and there's all the different variations of this, whether it's building code, residential code, and then essentially 2020 and 2021 and later added specific elements around accessibility for EV charging that really helped clarify things on it's basically 5% of EV charging spaces within a site must be accessible, not fewer than one. There is some scale to this, and again, depending on the regional adoption of this building code, it's usually state by state or city by city. There might be exemptions for certain housing types. There might be some nuance to this, but this is where, so the Fair Housing Act dictates 2%, but International Building Code is 5%. And in those cases where you might have two conflicting codes, you usually follow whatever the strictest code is as you're hopping between kind of federal, state, and local. So this is an example where building code provides the stronger standard. And then just the definition of what accessibility is from this case, where it defines a parking space as minimum width of 132 inches, adjoining to an access aisle that's a minimum of 60 inches wide. And that provides kind of access to the charger and then connects an accessible route to the building. And then a very vague statement in building code is EV charging must meet accessibility requirements similar to those for fuel dispensing systems. And that's where it just falls to this more ambiguous interpretation of what those codes are in terms of human interaction. Zooming into, so we've covered some of those federal policies, the state policies, building code. But some of the strongest can be found in local policies as well, where just to cite my local city in Ferndale, we've had a barrier-free electric vehicle parking ordinance since about 2019, and it's on its second revision right now. That just helps clarify kind of what the ratio is and what it should be, and it follows both the citation of the U.S. Access Board and provides just like a little technical guidance with a diagram as well. Colorado is another great example of, as a state, they adopted House Bill 24-1161 that went into effect in January of 26 and says something very similar where 5% and not less than one EV charging space has to be accessible and do its best to follow the U.S. Access Board guidelines until there's better federal ruling. And so these are kind of the building blocks that don't necessarily parse out exemptions for housing, and they help clarify and ascertain any EV charging in these communities has to be accessible. So what does that mean? So with kind of the ratio, that's one thing, and so much of the history of accessible parking is centered on kind of what's the percentage. But when it comes to all the technical elements, there's a lot to learn and be gained. And ultimately, it focuses on centering what works for people with disabilities in those environments and what do we need to be aware of as we're planning infrastructure. Electric vehicles, to circle back again on the benefits for people with disabilities, there's a huge kind of element of independence and liberation from the traditional gas station. Especially now as we're seeing the rising cost of gas. There's a big element of traditional fuel stations like aren't that accessible, and service-wise, there's some odd exemptions to the ADA, which was passed in 1990. That was an era in the United States where we had a lot more full-service gas stations. And so there was an assumption that there'd be an attendant there or somebody in the gas station to help you. And so on a lot of gas stations, as you pull up, there might be a phone number or something to call, but I have friends who are wheelchair users who have waited 1 up to 90 minutes in waiting for an attendant to come out to help them because a lot of gas stations, especially in rural areas, might be serviced by only one person. I actually saw a colleague of mine on LinkedIn this morning posted about she's a wheelchair user who lives in the Metro Toronto area and uses a fossil fuel powered vehicle. And she's going to a gas station that has changed their system to require like a reservation ahead of time to pull up and get that assistance. Which is Canada doesn't have the same standards that we do with the ADA, but it's completely inadequate. And so, thinking of the revolution and opportunity of electric vehicle infrastructure, we've got this opportunity to create something from the start that could be accessible for people with disabilities, but will it? And so, that's my shift and my challenge to everybody on this call is rather than thinking of things through ADA compliance, really focus on that fundamental question of how will people with disabilities use this? Of when you are on a road trip and go to pull up, how are people going to use every single site we're creating? Here's a picture of my wife of one of the brand new charging stations that was in Ferndale right after that ordinance was passed, and it didn't meet height parameters. So having that as a framing where we have to treat these standards and guidelines as a minimum framework so that we can create better innovation in the space. This is going to be mailed out. I'm not going to talk through everything in this slide, but this is the reference. So the US Access Board created their design guidelines for EV charging. It was released in 2022. And it really highlights all existing laws and regulations that are just focused on human interaction with things. And it summarizes them in one place. That guideline document is 90 pages long and it's a dense PDF. So unless you're working with an experienced accessibility professional to help interpret, it's very challenging. But this is kind of the Alan Hejl Spark Access best take at summarizing a 90-page PDF into one slide, where just those key dimensions and things to look out for. Accessible route, how are people getting from their vehicle to the charger or their vehicle to their car, to the entrance of the building? A barrier-free approach, having space around the charger to interact with it. Operable parts. 5 pounds of force is the hard one, and that's an area that needs innovation, but we need more people understanding that requirement of human interaction to get that innovation happening, where 5 pounds of force for cable management is a very difficult ask. But 15 to 48 inches of reach and operable parts in these guidelines is requested to apply to all chargers. So there's really no reason a charger should be out of a 48-inch reach for people to interact with it. And then having kind of the one we think of the most, and that's why I put it on the bottom because it's most covered in a lot of things, is what is like that accessible parking space and those dimensions for a van accessible space, and then having an access aisle next to it. And then something that really doesn't get discussed enough are the accessible communication features, where having proper signage of like what is this space that people are pulling up to, and how do we sign for that properly? Is the user interface of the charger, is that accessible for folks? One simple example in digital accessibility criteria is like sometimes we have red-green indicators for whether something's working or not working. Well, 1 in 12 men are colorblind. So that's usually not the most effective way to communicate things through red-green color differentials. And then for apps and web services that are serving EV chargers, whether it's for payment or management of knowing the status, those apps and services need to be accessible as well. So this is a lot to digest. I'm going to highlight just a few examples here so that you all can kind of take away what are the most important elements. But having that accessible EV parking, again, these space dimensions of the 11 feet wide by 20 feet long, and then having an access aisle, that's kind of the core requirement of what an accessible EV charger is. An important one as well is the accessible route, having a short path of travel that's at least 36 inches wide that gets you to the entrance. And it should have a minimum slope of 1 to 20. This is an important one as well of when folks arrive at a site, how do they get to the building? How do they get to their house in the context of multifamily charging and do that safely? If you have EV charging that's tucked away in the back of a property, it can be really difficult to navigate into your home if you've got groceries and other things. And so considering that is really important. A key one, again, with operable parts is that reach range of 15 to 48 inches with a maximum 10-inch inset. This is one that's missed a lot as well because as we're managing curbs, as we're managing asset protection with bollards and other things, making sure we're thinking of how people will interact with these chargers as we install them. And operable parts and that unobstructed reach should be applying to every single charger. So outside of the minimum 5%, this is just good design, and it is a requirement under the U.S. Access Board guidelines. And then thinking of the clear floor ground area is a really important dimension as well. I always kind of describe this as thinking of the magic carpet of you want to think of this like welcome space almost in front of an EV charger where you've got just maneuvering clearance and maneuvering room. And it's that 36 by 48 inch rectangle area that again allows for that 10-inch maximum inset reach. Signage is very nuanced. I'll say use of the international symbol of access, which is the traditional wheelchair user. That's a really complex item that the U.S. Access Board flagged, where use of that symbol essentially means that it's an accessible parking spot. And so if somebody has the plate and placard, no matter what vehicle they have, whether it's an EV or an ICE vehicle, if they have a plate or placard from their Secretary of State or whoever's managing that issuance, it's an accessible parking spot. And so they have a right to that spot that supersedes things at the federal level. So thinking of ways to remove that conflict is to use last signage instead. And so rather than highlight use of the ISA, unless it is a dedicated spot for accessible EV charging, that's 100% that use. It's advised to not use the ISA and to use these kind of examples that the U.S. Access Board provides for use last signage. And then that helps just differentiate kind of what blue line accessible spaces are versus what I would call the green line EV spaces. In the guide that's coming out, there's probably a whole other session we could do on this, but Anna and I work together to really highlight common conflicts. So across these different standards and what we see in developments and multifamily properties, there's a lot to be said for parking garages where it's a very constrained environment. So it's how do you fit all these technical requirements in something like that? How do you protect for accessible routes in the context of multifamily charging? If you have multiple EV charger sites, how do you account for that as well? And having kind of a fair distribution of accessibility across those. Clarifying a little more on digital accessibility, where it is a very vast field and there's a lot of different kind of digital aspects to EV charging. Retrofits of existing properties, and again, kind of the measurement of costs and how we start to weave that into plans for updating and modernizing facilities to make sure they're accessible for people with disabilities. And then something we took a lot of care for is outlining like how accommodations would work within the guide and in the context of assigned parking as well, where a lot of accessible housing units may have requirements for assigned parking. And then how do you make EV charging a part of that? So look forward to that in the guide, and hopefully we'll field a few questions here in just a moment. Just to kind of start closing us out, the key strategies I always highlight with Spark Access are to start with awareness and education. Sessions like this, where now everybody here knows the Fair Housing Act applies to EV charging and multifamily housing. Not a lot of folks knew that. So that's kind of a good starting point. And then how do you start weaving that into proactive programs and policies? And then how do you start getting feedback that what we're doing is actually working? So this is kind of the philosophy I have as Spark Access, where teaching kind of out of these three kind of pillars of building that framework of understanding accessibility, acting on accessibility upstream as we're working on our policies. And then ultimately it comes down to working with the disability community to know if it's working. And that can look like engaging with residents, or it can look like going outside for help. And so this is a template I often give folks is you have to find kind of your tribe. Every community is a little different when it comes to accessibility laws and regulations. And so knowing what that looks like in places, this is kind of a framework that exists in almost every community where you'll often have residents who are advocates and understand their needs as someone with a disability. So they're kind of first and foremost. That's the pillar of inclusive design is listening to them and trying to find what you can do to act. Centers for independent living are across every county in the United States. And you can usually find your local center for independent living. And a lot of them have ADA coordinators and folks on staff who are there to really protect for independent living of people with disabilities in our communities. So they'll understand some of the local housing nuance. A lot of cities have their own ADA coordinator. It's a requirement for any city of 50 or more employees that they have to have an ADA coordinator. So someone is going to have some knowledge of what needs to happen that might just not be a building code official. And then a lot of states or cities have commissions on disability who are also passionate about this and can help find answers. And then there's always local organizations as well, or local experts, as I do my work in Detroit is one example. So I think that closes us out. I know that was a lot of info in only about 40 minutes here. So I just want to thank everybody for tuning in and learning a little more on accessibility for multifamily charging. Here is my contact info. If anybody wants to ever reach out or connect or work with me on helping revise those policies, that's something I do a lot with folks. And then I dropped 2 links here as well for the U.S. Access Board, can always answer questions on the interpretation of the U.S. Access Board requirements. And then for questions on the Fair Housing Act, there's the Fair Housing Accessibility First. They have an email that they're very responsive with. As they called me back just a few weeks ago to clarify some questions I had. So I think with that, we'll open for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alan. I dropped your contact information. If anyone wants to get a hold of Alan, his email address as well as his website has been dropped in the chat. So we had some really great questions come through. We are recording those, and so we're just going to move right through them, Alan. And I'll start with the first one we received today from Caitlin, or excuse me, we addressed Caitlin's in the session from Eric. How does ADA impact upgrades or retrofits to existing properties?
Yeah, it's I think the quickest answer is you touch it, you fix it. And so the second anything is renovated, it usually has to be kind of brought up to whatever the most modern standard is. There's a lot of myth busting out there on, I think a lot of people have this assumption that grandfathering is a thing. And it really isn't with the ADA. And there was a point, I think the website's changed a couple times, but there was a point where on like ada.gov, there was a frequently asked questions section. And the number one was like, what if my building's grandfathered? And they clarified there is no such thing as grandfathering. Because again, the ADA is a civil rights law. And so it's up to kind of the entire system to meet that wherever it can. So the short answer is when you are renovating or modifying a site, it should be coming up to code as best you can. And every community interprets that a little differently, but it essentially, there's something called the 20% rule. And we explain this a little bit in the guide as well, where if accessibility were to exceed like 20% of a cost of renovation, then that could be construed as what's called undue burden, where it might be not efficient and cost efficient to make something accessible, but it's very rare that that doesn't apply. And then there's always like which elements can be accessible within that budget. And so it's usually not kind of a black and white cutoff. It's you've got to try to upgrade things to the best of your ability to capture as many of those accessible elements as you can.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. We'll move on to the next question. Alan, do you mind advancing to the roadmap slide just real quickly before folks
Oh,
start?
yeah.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, so the next question we have is also from Alan. Then we have a question from Caitlin. Alan's question, I'll drop in the chat again, is why do I keep hearing from project developers and electricians that super strict interpretation of ADA requirements by AHJ's local permitting authorities make many projects uneconomic?
Um, I, I yeah, I think the short answer is people don't understand the long-term scope of what they're building, and where, again, to circle back to the opening of the presentation, often they don't recognize like how many people with disabilities are in their community. So that alone is, I think it's rare for even local data. Um, the US average is 28.7%, but most communities, it's rarely under like even 15% if you zoom in. And so I think number one, people don't understand the human impact. And so that's a very hard thing to quantify is civil rights. It's hard to assign a dollar amount to that. And two is a bit of the consequences of because EV charging infrastructure is so new and because EV adoption is still growing. And because a lot of EVs, it was just announced at the New York Auto Show that the Kia PV5 is one of the first factory installed wheelchair accessible vehicles. Um, there's not a lot of drivers with disabilities who are being vocal about the infrastructure yet. But as things scale up, as things grow, we're going to see consequences on the civil rights aspect of that, and it's going to start with complaints, and then those complaints turn into lawsuits. And so, like my little like Alan crystal ball, as someone who has seen this play out in different aspects of mobility, is it's going to be really cheap to think of accessibility up front compared to the consequences later. I'm not a lawyer. I'll also say that. But that's just how these things play out is a lot of times people don't associate the long-term risk as they're trying to mitigate their requirements for accessibility.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. And these are great questions. So thank you for submitting them. The next question is from Caitlin. I just am about to drop in the chat for you, Alan, but the question is, I know there are a lot of concerns with cord cutting of chargers in public spaces. How can we plan for accessibility while mitigating cord cutting? What would using some sort of pulley system elevator that drops down the charger upon request work?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of innovation out there. What you're describing, I know there's actually an installation with Volt Post is going in a half mile from my house. And there are some innovations out there in that space. Um, I think my answer to all of that are all of these things provide uh, an opportunity to innovate in different ways. And it just comes down to making sure that we're doing functional testing with people with disabilities to get feedback and make sure it works. And that's something that comes up just all the time in the innovation industry. And I see it a lot in Detroit, where we have kind of our mobility ecosystem, and like the Detroit Smart Parking Lab is the hub for all this new technology coming to EV charging. And there's still a lot of claims of what may or may not work for people with disabilities, and it just comes down to like prove it. We got to test. You got to get data, just as we do for kind of all human centered design, making sure that that's woven in. And then I'd say too, like there's folks like It's Electric and a lot of European models out there for like the bring your own cable system. And that's something that is working for some people and it's not for others. But there's a lot of opportunity as well. Something I've seen from some international standards where there's a lot more attention really on like that interaction with the plug interface and what that cable looks like. Where the British Standard, for example, worked with a design firm that created all sorts of 3D printed grip accessories for their charging plugs. And so it provided for people who had like limited dexterity, or I know one very visible case was like an amputee who has a prosthetic arm. He was able to have like his charging cable that was custom designed for him for the grip, and it didn't change the cable interface at all. It changed like the housing around it, so it didn't affect the safety of it at all.
I
Yeah.
also want to jump in on this. The The drop-down method has been seen in some right-of-way uses and some fleet situations where you might like, you know, deal with the deal with like a design at ground level, and then once deal with like a screen or something like that, and the charger will come down from a bucket that's higher up. And obviously, what Alan said earlier, where theoretically most things can be designed in an accessible manner, you just have to prove it.
Yeah, and kind of related to that question, we have one from Eric asking about the bring your own cord method and if that would be considered accessible. And I think, Alan, you kind of talked about some use cases and examples. Um, but yeah, so it sounds like it's possible if the energy is put into researching and understanding what the true needs are of people with disabilities. So
Yeah.
uh, if you have anything else to add about the bring your own cord model related to accessibility, feel free to.
Yeah, I think just like some of those things where it is like curbside charging as well. Something I didn't zoom into in this presentation were the public right-of-way accessibility guidelines, where there's a growing movement both at the federal level and a lot of city and statewide adoptions for public right-of-way accessibility, where that's also a really key consideration, is making sure that whatever we are putting on the curb in terms of street furniture is the catch-all of anything we're putting on the sidewalks, making sure that it's not impeding accessibility so that pedestrians can get by and do it in a safe way. And so again, I think there's a lot of opportunity with some of these things, but it does come down to like testing and iteration and working with the disability community at the end of the day.
Awesome, thank you. And then I'm going to read off Caitlin's, though you might have covered parts of it. Related, I'm wondering whether people typically have two cords under BYOC models to leave at home and one for travel, and does that create another financial burden then?
Yeah, it's I mean I've still been just seeing the industry evolve, and I think It's Electric is one of the only BYOC companies like I'm really familiar with, and I know that they really work to kind of meet their customers with their needs, and they provide like that first cable for free.
Yeah, I also want to mention that It's Electric uses a different setup for bring your own cord than what you'd see at multifamily typically. Where the European standard, you have two physical EV charging plug ports that plug into the EV charger, and then one into the car. Whereas for the US model, you actually have the physical NEMA like plug that goes into a receptacle, rather than being sort of a EV plug that goes into a EV. So one end is the electrical prongs, and the other one goes into the car. And so there's sort of different bring your own charger, bring your own cord models. And this is definitely an area where I'm definitely expecting to see changes over the next decade. The European model does seem to have some benefits. And definitely keep your eye out on that. Um, Based on your question specifically for multifamily, from what I've seen, that it depends on the location, whether it's secure parking or not. But typically, people take their charger if it's either not secure parking, or if they're going on longer trips. If it's secure parking, particularly for condos, they plug in. They probably leave that charger in most of the vast majority of the time, because they're not going on long trips each day. So not a big issue there. There's not. I have not heard that has been a financial barrier for people.
Awesome. We are getting close to time. I saw your question, Rebecca. Since it's not multifamily focused, we have your email address. We'll reach out to you about your specific question. It's a great one. But we have a question from the registration. Let me see, where was it? Okay. How can site hosts balance additional costs and space constraints often associated with ADA compliant chargers?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. There was, I'd say, before the U.S. Access Board guidelines released, a lot of the education that was out there, going back to some of the original ordinances from California in 2013, and some guidance from the Department of Energy in 2014 really relied on like adjacency to existing accessible parking spaces where you might be installing your EV charging next to an accessible parking space so that they can share an access aisle. And in a lot of constrained parking environments and where like you might be upfitting or rehabbing these new installations into existing infrastructure, that can still be an option. It just requires a lot of thought and care for the operability and making sure that it can serve um, kind of both sides of that access aisle if needed. Um, but something to think of is kind of like creativity within existing infrastructure where you can find those dimensions usually in different ways. And there's, I mean, in any parking garage, you can find this being done of just like accessible parking. And then how that's extending to EV charging is just like getting those access aisles and using the unused space in a garage, which there's always surprisingly a lot of.
Awesome. We're at time. Alan, do you mind advancing to the last slide, please?
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Alan. That was awesome. I just want to reiterate, we have a lot of great questions, a few that came in before during registration. We've marked our email addresses. We will reach out. I want to flag specifically to Natalie Pearson. We will be reaching out to you specifically to talk about your question with local governments engaging with multifamily property owners. So look for an email from me soon. But yeah, thanks again, Alan. This was wonderful. The presentation is being recorded and we uploaded to our website, which I just dropped. I dropped in the chat earlier, but we'll have Whit drop again for me on our resources page. If you want to email us, there's our general email address, and then we also have in the chat mine and Whit's email addresses. We have a great newsletter we encourage you to sign up for. That's how you know about what's coming up. We also have a LinkedIn page. So yeah, thank you again. Thank you, Whit. And keep a lookout for that great document that Alan referenced. It'll be coming through our newsletter and on our website on the resources page. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good run. Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Alan. Seriously, so much good work.